Court records from Oklahoma Territory whisper of a woman whose very name made plantation owners fall silent. Sarah Granger, a name spoken with equal parts terror and fascination across 3 counties, stood trial not once, but for separate times between 1847 and 1856. Each trial involved a peculiar charge: grievous assault upon the person of her lawful master. Each time, the courtroom emptied of women and children before testimony began, and each time, despite overwhelming evidence, no jury would convict her. The authorities knew what she'd done. The community knew, yet something about Sarah Granger's case made even hardened frontier judges look away, begging the question: what could drive a legal system built on absolute control to repeatedly release its most dangerous captive? The wounds she inflicted were too specific, too calculated, too permanent. 3 men lost their ability to father children. A 4th lost something else entirely: his mind. They say, though, the official record lists only severe trauma. Before we delve into the truth, ensure you are subscribed to the Forgotten Liturgy, and hit that notification bell, because stories like this, the ones they tried to bury in forgotten court archives, don't surface often. The question of what made Sarah Granger so dangerous wasn't answered by her appearance alone. Standing just over 5 feet tall, she possessed hands that seemed too delicate for the cotton fields where she'd spent most of her 32 years. Her face bore a single, distinctive mark, a thin scar running from her left temple to her jawline, courtesy of an overseer's whip when she was 14. But it was her eyes that unsettled people. They didn't carry the expected downcast submission. They measured, they calculated, they remembered everything. Sarah was born in 1824 in northern Alabama. Her first master, Edmund Hartwell, was considered reasonable, feeding his workers adequately and only punishing when drunk. It was here that Sarah achieved the illegal and dangerous education that would later prove essential to her survival. She learned to read by watching Hartwell's daughter practice her letters through a crack in the schoolroom wall. When Hartwell died in 1842, Sarah was 18, strong, literate, and valuable. She was sold for $850 to a cotton trader named James Wickham, a sale that tore her away from her mother, her 2 younger brothers, and the only home she'd ever known. The 6-week journey west to Oklahoma Territory found her chained in a wagon, watching the landscape change from green hills to endless prairie. Oklahoma Territory in 1842 was a place caught between identities. Officially Indian Territory, yet increasingly populated by white settlers who brought their peculiar institutions with them. Wickham's 300-acre holdings lay 15 miles south of Fort Gibson, a plantation worked by 42 men, women, and children. The overseer, a thick-necked Georgian named Walter Prout, ran the fields with methodical brutality: 20 lashes for talking, 34 leaving the fields, 54 striking back punishments administered publicly every Saturday after sundown. Sarah spent her first 5 months keeping her head down and her literacy hidden. She picked cotton with mechanical efficiency, learning which workers could be trusted and which would trade information for extra rations. She quickly learned the patterns of the plantation's power structure. James Wickham visited the cabins on Tuesday nights, coinciding with his wife Charlotte's visits to Fort Gibson. Charlotte Wickham, once a Charleston belle, was now 34, childless, and sustained by laudanum, and the pretense that her husband's nocturnal wanderings were merely property inspections. She spent her days in the parlor, playing the same Chopin nocturne over and over until the notes seemed to bleed into the walls. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday in late November 1842. 5 months after Sarah's arrival. Wickham appeared at her cabin door just after 10 p.m. He carried no lamp, knowing the path too well. The other women in the cabin didn't move, adhering to the unspoken rule: you pretended not to see, not to hear, not to know. Wickham stood over Sarah's pallet. She could smell the whiskey on him mixed with tobacco and pomade. When he reached down and touched her shoulder, she didn't flinch. She simply said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I'll kill you if you touch me again." He laughed. The sound was soft, almost fond, as if she'd told a clever joke. Wickham's hand moved from Sarah's shoulder to her throat, not squeezing, but resting there, a cold reminder of the absolute power differential. What followed took perhaps 3 seconds. Sarah's hand, hidden beneath her thin blanket, emerged holding a metallic cotton knife stolen from the gin house. There was a brief, violent, and precise motion. Wickham made a sound, not a scream, but like all the air leaving his lungs at once, and staggered backward as blood soaked through his trousers with shocking speed. Sarah stood and walked past him, directly to the main house. She knocked on the door with the calm precision of someone delivering an expected message. Charlotte Wickham, already awake, Her eyes glazed with laudanum, answered. Sarah held out the bloodied knife handle first. Your husband tried to force himself on me. I've injured him. He's in cabin 4. He'll need a doctor. Then she sat down on the porch steps and waited. Dr. Theodore Gaines rode 14 miles at midnight to attend to an injury he was later unable to describe in detail. The medical records listed only severe trauma to the gentleman's person, rendering future marital relations inadvisable. In stark terms, Sarah had castrated James Wickham with a 3-inch cotton knife, the cut so clean that Gaines, in his private journal, noted she possessed remarkable anatomical knowledge. Wickham survived physically but spent 6 weeks recovering while Charlotte continued her unsettling piano practice downstairs. The legal question that followed became Oklahoma Territory's most uncomfortable conversation. Territorial law was clear. A slave who caused permanent injury to a master should be executed. But Wickham's nocturnal visit, the nature of the injury, and Sarah's immediate surrender created public complications no one wanted to address. Judge Samuel Breenidge, a frontier transplant, interviewed Sarah privately. She confirmed she had taken the knife 2 weeks prior, anticipating the visit, and that she knew the anatomy well enough to ensure the injury was permanent. When Breenidge asked why she chose such a specific punishment, her answer chilled him. I wanted to make sure he could undo to anyone else what he tried to do to me. The trial lasted 1 day. Wickham was absent, unable to face a courtroom where his humiliation would become public. The defense came from an unexpected source. William Hutjo, a Creek tribal delegate, argued that under tribal law, which still technically applied, Sarah's actions constituted self-defense against sexual assault. Hutjo's presence was unprecedented, yet Judge Breenidge allowed him to speak. The all-white jury deliberated for 7 hours and returned a verdict of not guilty. Territorial prosecutors were outraged, and Baptist ministers warned of chaos, but Breenidge stood by the verdict. Sarah was immediately sold to Marcus Sheffield, a widower who operated a smaller farm 30 miles west. The price was $600, reflecting her diminished value due to criminal tendencies. Sarah had been on Sheffield's property for only 4 months when she cut him, too. The pattern was established. The circumstances were almost identical. A late-night visit, an attempted assault, and Sarah's swift, anatomically precise response, this time using a straight razor stolen from Sheffield's shaving kit. Sheffield survived with better physical health, but the damage was severe enough that he would never father children. The second trial drew a massive crowd. It was a referendum on questions the territory did not want to ask. Could property defend itself against its owner? This time, Sarah testified. Over the prosecutor's furious objections, she spoke for 2 hours, describing her life and the way the other women had learned to pretend sleep, to become invisible to survive. She explained, with unsettling calm, that after Wickham, she had incorrectly assumed her reputation would protect her from future assaults. I thought, Sarah said, looking directly at the jury during her second trial, that once a man knew what I was capable of, he would choose differently. I was wrong about that. Mr. Sheffield knew exactly what happened to Mr. Wickham. He bought me anyway. When the prosecutor, Harrison Tate, demanded to know if she felt any remorse, Sarah's answer became instantly famous. I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret defending myself. The jury deliberated for 11 hours and returned the same verdict, not guilty. Sheffield sold her immediately for $420. The declining price reflecting the known risk. Buying Sarah Granger meant accepting the possibility of permanent injury. Her next owner, Elias Drummond, lasted 9 months before Sarah cut him. Same pattern, same outcomer, late-night assault attempt, met with a precise injury using a paring knife honed to surgical sharpness on the millstone. Dr. Gaines, summoned for the 3rd time, noted in his private journal that Sarah possessed anatomical knowledge that would be impressive in a medical student. The 3rd trial drew national attention, with abolitionist papers praising her resistance while pro-slavery publications demanded her execution. Yet, the pattern held. Despite overwhelming evidence, the jury acquitted her after a 15-hour deliberation, with 2 jurors later admitting they believed her legally guilty but couldn't bring themselves to convict. Drummond didn't sell Sarah, he freed her. The manumission papers, filed in December 1851, cited irreconcilable differences in temperament. He paid her $75 and arranged transportation to Fort Smith, Arkansas, where she lived for 3 years, working as a seamstress and furthering her literacy. But in May 1854, Sarah returned. She walked 43 miles back into Indian Territory and presented herself at the Fort Gibson courthouse to testify at a trial. not her own but that of a 19-year-old woman named Hannah accused of striking her master with a fire poker. Hannah's defense was shaky, lacking the clear pattern of attempted assault seen in Sarah's own cases. Judge Breenidge, now 63 and weary of the territory's contradictions, initially refused to allow Sarah's testimony, but Sarah had anticipated this. She presented 4 years of correspondence letters from women across 3 territories, describing similar patterns of assault and retaliation, a secret network of information she had cultivated using her literacy. Breenidge reviewed the correspondence and made an unprecedented decision. He would allow Sarah to testify not as a fact witness, but as an expert in matters of self-defense against sexual assault. Sarah testified for 3 days. She described the patterns she had documented, the time of night assaults occurred, the excuses masters gave, and the protective strategies developed by enslaved communities. She explained the anatomy of self-defense, why precision was critical, and which injuries were most effective as deterrents. The prosecutor, Harrison Tate, repeatedly tried to make her admit to premeditation. Each time, Sarah gave the same answer: "I prepared for the possibility of needing to defend myself. That's not the same as planning to attack someone." Hannah was acquitted after 19 hours of deliberation, with the foreman later telling a newspaper that Sarah's testimony was the deciding factor, making them understand things we'd preferred not to think about. Sarah's return triggered something unexpected. Other women began seeking her out in secret, traveling miles at night for advice. Sarah answered their questions with calm precision. She taught them anatomy from memory, drawing diagrams in dirt or ash, explaining which injuries were most effective, which left the least room for retaliation, and which could be defended in court as a proportionate response. She never encouraged violence, but provided the knowledge for each woman to decide for herself. The plantation owners noticed. Between 1854 and 1856, 9 separate incidents occurred across Oklahoma and Arkansas cases where enslaved women injured masters or overseers who attempted assault, all bearing the unmistakable pattern of Sarah's signature technique: precise, calculated, aimed at specific anatomical targets. A group of 23 plantation owners formed the Territorial Property Protection Committee. They hired Cornelius Vance, a specialist in servile insurrection law from Richmond, Virginia, with one goal: to find a legal mechanism to charge Sarah Granger with something that would stick. Since she was acquitted of the assaults and was a free woman, Vance couldn't use those charges. Instead, he found an obscure statute based on English common law: conspiracy to commit mayhem. Opka Part 4, Sarah Granger, Ki Kahani, KO Legal Battle, KI Final Climax, Takla Yotahai, Jahan, Use Conspiracy to Commit Mayhem, K Gurmamuli, Unusual Charge, Parchothi, Bar 4th, Time Trial, KI Somna, Kana Patahai, Cornelius, Vance K Organized Resistance, KI Argument, Sarah KI Resistance Archive, Hoth Say Liquor, Hua Handbook for Resistance, or Jury, KI Astonishing Verdict, Not Guilty. Jesk Soft Policy Statement, B Shamel Tha is Bot KO, Cement Carter, High Kiosk, Kai Kiosk, Actions Ni Societal Foundations, KO, Hiladaya Tha, Judge Breenidge, Ka Heartfelt Letter, Legal System, Key Moral Bankruptcy, KO Reveal, Carter High. The charge of conspiracy to commit mayhem did unrequire proof that Sarah had directly participated in any attack, only that she'd provided knowledge and encouragement. The 4th trial began in August 1856. The prosecution, led by the skilled lawyer Cornelius Vance, called 17 witnesses, including injured masters and overseers. Judge Breenidge, visibly frail, presided over what everyone knew would be his final significant case. Sarah's volunteer defense team argued that teaching self-defense couldn't constitute conspiracy. Vance, however, reframed the question brilliantly. Did you and Sarah S. lessons? And the consistency of the injuries across multiple incidents suggest calculated, premeditated action and coordination rather than individual desperate acts. The prosecution's testimony revealed something that horrified them even as they presented it. Sarah had just been teaching anatomy. She'd been documenting everything. In a rented room, investigators found 47 letters, 6 journals, and detailed records of assaults, legal proceedings, and outcomes across 5 territories. This was a comprehensive archive of resistance, a handbook for self-defense and legal strategies that protected those who defended themselves. Vance held up these documents, declaring, "This is not spontaneous self-defense, this is organized resistance. This is a deliberate campaign to undermine the fundamental structure of our society." Sarah's lead attorney Robert Chenoweth argued powerfully, "What kind of conspiracy requires no secrecy? because it consists entirely of teaching women how to protect themselves from assault. He called it the natural consequence of a system that provides no other protection. The jury deliberated for 4 days, during which Fort Gibson existed in a state of suspended tension. Federal troops patrolled, and plantation owners compared notes on increasingly difficult workers. Meanwhile, Judge Brinage used those 4 days to write a personal letter to his daughter, which survived in family archives. He wrote that Sarah's trials forced the territory to confront the central question: can a legal system built on absolute property rights acknowledge that some forms of property have the right to defend themselves? He concluded, Sarah Granger is guilty of only one crime, refusing to accept the premise that her body belongs to anyone but herself. Brinage died of heart failure. On the 3rd day of deliberation, the trial resumed under a younger judge. When the jury finally returned, the foreman read the verdict, not guilty on all charges, but he didn't stop there. In an unprecedented edition, he read a statement written by the jury. We find the defendant not guilty of conspiracy because we cannot in good conscience criminalize the act of teaching women to protect themselves from assault. The statement recommended that territorial authorities establish clear legal protections for enslaved persons against sexual assault, thus declaring that the problem wasn't Sarah's actions, but the system that made her actions necessary. Vance immediately appealed, and the Territorial Property Protection Committee announced a $500 reward for information leading to Sarah's conviction. However, something had fundamentally shifted. The consensus among the white population that the system was unquestionable had fractured. Presbyterian ministers began preaching about moral complexity. The territorial legislature received petitions for legal protections, though the government, dominated by plantation interests, ignored them. Sarah herself seemed detached from the controversy. She continued her quiet life as a seamstress, maintaining her correspondence, but she was also preparing. In the 18 months following her acquittal, she began transferring her documents, the archive of resistance, to a network of safe locations, churches, private homes, even a Creek Nation council house, ensuring the information would survive even if one location was raided. She also began training others 3 women in the anatomy, legal strategies, and the methodical documentation methods that made her archive so valuable, ensuring her work would continue. In December 1857, 2 federal marshals arrested Sarah on charges of mail fraud. The charge was technically absurd. She was accused of using the postal system to distribute information that endangered public safety. Everyone understood this was simply the latest legal attempt to silence her. This time, Judge Patterson allowed no discussion of self-defense. The question was simply whether Sarah had violated federal postal regulations. The jury returned a guilty verdict in 40 minutes. Patterson sentenced her to 18 months in federal detention at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, followed by permanent exile from Oklahoma Territory. As marshals led her away, Sarah turned and spoke directly to the gallery. They can exile one woman. They cannot exile the knowledge I've shared. Remember that. Fort Leavenworth in 1858 was a harsh military prison. Sarah was assigned to the women's section, a damp limestone building where she worked in the laundry, scrubbing uniforms by hand and scalding water alongside 16 other women convicted of crimes ranging from theft to murder. The cruelty was systemic, enforced by guards with detached mechanical consistency. Sarah adapted with the same calm precision she'd brought to everything else. She worked efficiently and caused no trouble. The other inmates knew her reputation from the newspapers. When asked directly about her trials, Sarah simply said, "What I did for reasons that made sense at the time. What you've heard is probably close enough to the truth." She occupied an unusual position in the prison hierarchy. Her violence was defensive, not predatory, giving her a respected distance. Women sought her out for advice on navigation, how to endure, how to maintain dignity, and how to hold on to oneself when the institution tried to erase one's identity. She advised them, find a rhythm that makes time bearable rather than torturous. Be invisible when it serves you, visible when it protects you. The only power we have is the power to be remembered accurately. Write letters, document everything. What the authorities didn't know was that Sarah had anticipated this outcome. Before her final trial, she had thoroughly trained her 3 successors and finished transferring all her documents. The Archive of Resistance now existed in distributed form across 3 territories and churches, private homes, and tribal archives, copied and recopied by women who understood its value. In March 1858, she received a coded letter from her network. The garden you planted continues to grow. We've harvested seeds and replanted them in new locations. We tend them carefully and think of you with gratitude. That knowledge provided a peace she hadn't expected to find within those limestone walls. Imprisonment also provided time to reflect. In letters to friends in Fort Gibson, letters the guards read but could uncensor, she began to articulate a more complex philosophy of resistance. I would do it again given the same circumstances, she wrote, but I wonder sometimes if IVA becomes so focused on the immediate act of resistance that IVA failed to imagine what might come after. How do we build lives that don't require us to become dangerous in order to survive? She noted how the stories of her fellow inmates, who committed crimes out of desperation, reminded her that sometimes survival itself is resistance. Sometimes just continuing to exist, refusing to be erased, is the most radical act possible. Sarah marked time by the changes in light through the high windows, the shifting angle of the sun, and the changing smells of the seasons. In July 1858, 6 months into her sentence, something unexpected happened. A group of women, white women, black women, Creek, and Cherokee women crossed racial and legal boundaries to petition the territorial governor for Sarah's early release, arguing her conviction was merely an attempt to silence her. The petition carried 127 signatures. The petition to the governor, signed by 127 women across racial and legal boundaries, was a remarkable document. It systematically argued that Sarah's conviction for mail fraud was a miscarriage of justice, noting the unusual brevity of the trial and the selective prosecution. More significantly, it argued that Sarah's real crime had been teaching women to defend themselves against assault, a service that should be recognized as a public good. This bold language, signed by the wives of military officers, teachers, and shopkeepers, demonstrated the breadth of Sarah's influence. Though Governor William Seward dismissed it without comment, the petition proved that the seed she'd planted was bearing fruit. The petition, however, increased scrutiny on Sarah within Fort Leavenworth. The commandant, Colonel Marcus Hayes, ordered her letters and interactions monitored, fearing she was organizing resistance. But Sarah had anticipated this, maintaining friendly but superficial relationships and crafting her letters carefully, ensuring authorities found nothing actionable. August 1858 brought a brutal heatwave, turning the limestone prison into torture. 3 women died from heatstroke and dysentery. Sarah survived through the same strategies that had sustained her through slavery: methodical hydration, careful rationing of energy, and mental discipline. She understood that pain was inevitable, but suffering was a choice in how you process that pain. By October, her health began to fail. The perpetual dampness, exhaustion, and harsh laundry chemicals caused a persistent cough and fevers. By early November, her condition was critical. Dr. Albert Richardson diagnosed pneumonia and prescribed bed rest and transfer to the infirmary, a request Colonel Hayes approved, but denied the crucial request for improved rations, citing budget constraints. The government's obligation was to confine her safely, not to ensure her comfort or recovery, Hayes explained. For 3 weeks in the infirmary, Sarah drifted between consciousness and delirium. She dreamed of her past, of Alabama, of her mother, of the moment she decided survival required becoming dangerous. She also dreamed of the archive she'd built, a solid, permanent building made of paper and ink where people walked through, reading the walls, learning from the documented resistance of women who had refused to accept their own powerlessness. The prison chaplain, Reverend Thomas Blackwell, visited frequently, preaching about repentance and surrendering pride. On his final visit in late November, Sarah was lucid enough to respond, her voice barely a whisper. Have you ever considered that maybe some things we call sins are actually refusals to participate in greater sins? That defending yourself isn't the same as attacking someone? Blackwell could only respond by citing the Bible's authority on submission and rendering unto Caesar. In her letters to friends during this time, Sarah grappled with the deeper philosophical questions her resistance had raised. I wonder sometimes if IVE becomes so focused on the immediate act of resistance that IVE failed to imagine what might come after. How do we build lives that don't require us to become dangerous in order to survive? She realized that sometimes survival itself is resistance. These letters revealed a Sarah Granger far more thoughtful and conflicted than the figure portrayed in court. A woman grappling with how to move from mere resistance to genuine freedom. They exist. Sarah replied to Reverend Blackwell about the principles of submission, because they're convenient for people in power, but they weren't written by women in cabins waiting for Tuesday night visits. They weren't written by people who had to choose between violence and violation. Blackwell left in silence, never visiting again. Dr. Richardson documented her inevitable decline. Frustrated by the system's inflexibility that denied her the preventative care that might have saved her, on December 1st, in a period of unexpected lucidity, Sarah asked for paper and pen to write final letters. She wrote 3, the first to her friends, urging them to continue the work, the second to Elizabeth and her other successors, providing final instructions for maintaining and expanding the archive. The third was to Judge Breenidge's daughter in Philadelphia, who was involved in abolitionist work. Sarah wrote, "Your father understood something that many men in his position refuse to see, that law without justice is simply organized violence. Tell your children that there was once a judge in Oklahoma Territory who chose conscience over convention. In a better world, that wouldn't be noteworthy. In this world, it's worth remembering." She sealed the letters and entrusted them to Mrs. Hale. On December 3, 1858, just after dawn, Sarah Granger died at age 34 from pneumonia. Her final words, whispered so quietly they were almost missed, were, "The work continues." News of Sarah's death reached Oklahoma Territory 2 weeks later, minimized by the territorial newspaper as an administrative detail. But within the communities she served, the news traveled differently, sparking renewed determination. Cornelius Vance, the lawyer who secured her conviction, felt relief but also unease, writing that he wondered if the damage she caused will prove more lasting than we anticipate. He was right. The archive she built became more valuable and carefully protected in her absence. Her 3 trained successors intensified their documentation efforts, viewing themselves as custodians of a legacy that demanded continuation. Elizabeth wrote in her journal, "She taught us that knowledge is the only power we truly possess." They could imprison her body, silence her voice, but they could not erase what she documented. That work continues, will continue, must continue until the need for such knowledge no longer exists. The network proved remarkably resilient. In the 18 months following her death, the documentation system expanded, incorporating new correspondents who had never met Sarah. The archive grew more comprehensive, even as its founder lay in an unmarked grave. Though authorities intercepted a packet of letters in April 1859 and arrested 5 women for conspiracy, the subsequent trial backfired. The defense attorneys entered the full contents of the intercepted letters into the court record, making public the patterns of assault and lack of legal protection that Sarah had documented. The women were convicted but received surprisingly light sentences, 6 months in county jail, with the judge noting that lawmakers should address the underlying conditions rather than merely punishing those who document them. Sarah's work had forced certain conversations into the public sphere. The archives Sarah built outlasted her by decades. Her documents were gradually consolidated in the 1870s and 1880s, stored in church basements, incorporated into early African American historical societies, and transferred to Creek Nation archives. A significant portion was discovered by a Presbyterian minister, Harold Thompson, hidden beneath a pulpit in Fort Gibson. Thompson, recognizing their historical importance, cataloged them and donated them to a seminary library in Ohio. Acknowledging the profound discomfort these documents caused, yet recognizing their necessary truth, the letters described a world the minister Harold Thompson had witnessed but preferred not to acknowledge, acts of resistance he knew occurred but chose to ignore. He preserved them, writing in 1877, "Future generations deserve to know what really happened, not the sanitized version we tell ourselves to maintain comfortable consciences." The legal legacy of Sarah's trials proved indirect but enduring. Although her acquittals established no formal precedent, judges between 1859 and 1865 increasingly referenced self-defense under duress in cases involving enslaved persons assaulting their masters. Though never citing Sarah Granger by name, her legal reasoning continued shaping outcomes. Difficult to trace, but real. More significant was the cultural impact. The women Sarah trained continued her work, documenting assaults, teachings, and building communication networks that proved crucial during the chaos of the Civil War. When federal troops occupied Oklahoma Territory in 1863, Major Benjamin Harris, a Union officer, noted in his official report, "The Negro population here displays an unexpected level of organization and legal knowledge. They maintain extensive documentation of their circumstances, ... double quotes he didn't know he was observing." The fruits of Sarah Granger's decade-old initiative. The 3 men Sarah injured lived out their lives in obscurity. James Wickham moved to New Orleans, died of yellow fever in 1873. and his estate included a carefully preserved newspaper clipping about Sarah's trials, a testament to her lasting psychological effect. Marcus Sheffield became a territorial legislator, indirectly acknowledging his own past in a speech. "We built a system that demanded certain people bear unbearable burdens, then expressed shock when they refused." Elias Drummond, who had freed her, became a vocal advocate for emancipation, publicly stating that Sarah's correction changed how I understood the world. Sarah's grave at Fort Leavenworth was cleared in the 1920s. Her remains moved to an unmarked mass grave, precisely the kind of erasure she had fought against. However, in 1891, a researcher named Margaret Hutchinson discovered a trunk of her letters in a Presbyterian church in Tahlequah. Hutchinson's subsequent 1893 article, "A Peculiar Case of Resistance," proved the meticulous accuracy of Sarah's documentation, while mainstream historians, focused on the lost cause mythology, ignored the piece. It became highly influential among African American historians and women's rights activists, ensuring Sarah's name began appearing in histories where it had been absent. The archive itself, the documents scattered across multiple territories, survived her by decades, demonstrating the stubborn persistence of knowledge. The questions her life and death raised about property rights versus human rights, about self-defense under oppression, didn't disappear. They simply continued, unanswered within the frameworks that had generated them. What made Sarah Granger revolutionary was deceptively simple. She transformed individual moments of self-defense into a documented pattern. She turned personal tragedies into evidence of systematic abuse. A woman who defended herself was a problem. A woman who taught others was a crisis. But a woman who documented the patterns, preserved the evidence, and built systems for sharing that knowledge across time and distance, that was revolutionary. The system convicted and imprisoned her to silence her without creating a martyr. But Sarah had anticipated even this. The archive existed independent of her. The knowledge had been shared too widely to be suppressed. She had built something that could function without her, and it did. Sarah Granger died in an unmarked grave at age 34, but her work survived, ensuring that her story, too controversial to celebrate, yet too significant to completely erase, exists in that uncomfortable space where history acknowledges events without quite knowing how to judge them. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Sarah Granger's actions were justified given her circumstances? How should we understand resistance that uses violence in self-defense? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this historical mystery, subscribe to The Forgotten Liturgy, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who appreciates complex, difficult histories.